Hi, this is Siofra's Magic Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan. So, last video we talked about energy healing, and it just seemed the right time to talk about self-healing, because healing yourself is, in my opinion, the most important thing that this path has to offer. So there's a trigger warning here for anyone who has had abusive background. I'm going to talk about mine in more detail than I usually do, because I think it's important to know where things started and how I got to where I am, if that makes sense. So, I was born into a family of severe abuse. The first experience that I had of being abused was by my uncle when I was like 5 or 6 years old. And I woke up in the middle of the night. It was during a holiday. We only saw them Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter, so I'm not sure which one it was, if it was the Easter one or whenever. It's one of those things that's impossible to know from now, anyway. But I woke up in the middle of the night to him being over me, and I heard a voice in my head, and it said, "This is a bad place to be awake, go to sleep now." So I did. I went back to sleep, which I'm sure was a very protective mechanism to keep me from experiencing the full onslaught. I knew it was wrong, I knew it was bad, and I wanted to tell my parents about it, but I was worried that if I told my father too soon, he would hurt my uncle, and I didn't want anyone to get hurt, because, I was little. So I waited, and I remember this pretty vividly, watching the road signs and waiting to see the sign that said, "Welcome to Rhode Island." And as soon as I saw that sign, then I knew that we were almost home because we lived in Rhode Island. And then I told my mother and my father in the car. I'm the oldest in my family, the oldest child. I'm also the oldest grandchild, the first grandchild. So I was kind of like, the spearhead for all the things that followed afterwards. So immediately, of course, my father said he was inclined to turn around and go back and kill my uncle. My mother talked him out of it. We went home, and after that, nothing happened. I continued to see my uncle every holiday. Either they came up to visit us or we went down to visit them, whatever was going on. But as far as I know, my uncle never went after me again. And I think that's probably because I went back to sleep in the middle of what was happening, and maybe that just didn't give him what he was looking for. However, because no one did anything about it, that meant that my sister and my brother and my youngest sister, who just barely managed to avoid the situation because my other sister, actually confronted my uncle about it and said that she would tell if he didn't leave her alone. He also got his children, his daughter and his son, and I'm not sure how many others, and never was actually confronted with what happened until he went after a child in the neighborhood, not one of his relatives. And so I really didn't understand the significance of what was going on in the larger picture because I was so little when it got started. But I remembered it, and it affected me. And since we continued to see him every single time we went to a family event during the holidays, my extended family, my grandparents and everybody else, they were all like huggers. Everybody grabbed everybody and hugged them and kissed them and all this other stuff. And I wasn't permitted to have boundaries. I wasn't allowed to say no to anything. And so I had to sort of get reviolated every time I saw my uncle because I would smell him, and that was my biggest memory, was his breath, the smell of him. So it was kind of gross, and I definitely didn't like it. And certainly, looking back, didn't feel protected by my parents, either one of them. Let's see. Looks like I get a dry mouth with talking about the subject, so. and that is a BPA-free bottle, for those of you who are worried about me and my other water bottle. Um, so, so that was one part of it. The other part was my house, living in my house. My father was a sadist, and torture was one of the things that he enjoyed doing to us. And as the oldest child, I got the brunt of it in the beginning, and then my brother, who was the next eldest, because he was a boy, there was something about him that my father disliked or wanted to fix. I don't know. I can't understand people like that. But that was all the time. So the only time we were we had to pretend to be happy was when we were with the extended family, with the other aunts and uncles, and at these gatherings around the holidays. And so I still actually sometimes have a problem with Christmas, because that was one of those real trigger days. Was the only day I was allowed to like wake up my father without the possibility of being tortured for who knows how long. And that split between how you were supposed to be, what you saw on TV, and what everyone wanted you to be, and then the reality of being there. Uh, it creates this cognitive dissonance where you can't really process that in an effective way. And I probably never slept a night without fear, not knowing when I went to bed if my father was going to suddenly realize that he had forgotten to punish us for some unknown thing we hadn't done, and decide to wake people up and start, beating them in the middle of the night. And he didn't just torture us, he also tortured our animals, my cat in particular, which was very difficult for me to deal with, listening to him. And then later having him brag about it. He would hold my cat by her tail and hang her upside down. Sorry. That's just a terrible thing to do. Even though it was so long ago, it still affects me. So, this is just as a way of explaining and sharing that there are terrible things that happen to people, but that doesn't mean that you can't heal. And even though it affects me to talk about it, that just shows that I have compassion and empathy, and I have a heart, because no matter how long ago it was wrong. It's still wrong. My father is not around anymore, which is makes the universe a slightly safer place to be. So add to all of that kind of home environment that I was in, and then add going to church on top of that. And, when you're a kid, you don't have much choice as to where you go and what you do. Your parents kind of pull you along whatever path that they're on. And my mother went to the Methodist church, and the things that I learned there was that there was something wrong with me again, that being a girl was bad, that just having been born female meant that somehow I was responsible for all the terrible things that happened in the world, which may not be what other people get out of it, but that's definitely what I got out of it. And I had a feeling, that's why it's been hard to do this video. I cried myself to sleep every night, sometimes for hours, because I thought there was just something wrong with me. That the universe must hate me, or I was evil somehow, that these things kept happening to me and around me. And when you're that little and undeveloped emotionally, intellectually, all of that, there's you can't separate yourself from what's happening to you and the nature of reality. It's all kind of one thing because you're at the center of the universe. Everything is you by extension. And so when you're raised in an environment where you're not allowed to differentiate yourself from anyone else, you can't have boundaries, there's no privacy. The parents who are supposed to protect you and love you either torture and violate you or don't protect you and try to pretend everything is okay. You're not learning good things. So, so it doesn't really set you up for success in relationships, to say the least. And when I left home and got away from my father, the first person I ended up with, my first husband, was a sociopath and a serial rapist. So, not much of a step up from my father, the sadist alcoholic. And I remember thinking when I first met this sociopath that he somehow understood me, that he got me, that he knew something about me or who I was. And I had this idea, being raised back then in the 50s, the fairy tale kind of thing was really huge. Everything you saw on TV, because TV was still pretty new, was all about that knight in shining armor coming to rescue you or whatever. It was sort of imprinted inside of me. And so I thought that's what it was, that was the goal in existence, was to find someone and marry them. And that validated your reason for being, which was really funny in retrospect, considering it's really not. So there was a lot of abuse in that relationship, and we were together for like 3 years before he went to prison for rape. And that was very bizarre. That was right after my son was born. My son was like 2 months old when he went to prison. And when that happened, the people I was living with at the time, they were kind of crazy too. We were living with another couple, and they decided that rape might be genetic. And I had a boy, so they tried to talk me into the idea of murdering my son so he wouldn't grow up to be a rapist. Fortunately, I do have some sense, even in the midst of all the stupidity and craziness of my childhood and bad modeling and everything else that was there, that this was really seriously wrong. And no one should ever do that, and it was really a dumb idea. And I took my son and flew back to the States. I was living in Canada when he was born, and went home to my mother because I knew at least she wouldn't want to have him killed for some strange notion. Intellectualization is sometimes a very dangerous thing. And so, relationships continued on that way, various ones that didn't work for one reason or another, because I was looking outward, trying to find something to fill a void. And I left my second husband because he beat both my son and his daughter that we had together. And I had to escape with them, much to his chagrin and annoyance. He also became extremely Christian and tried to use that against me. By then, I was seriously not a Christian anymore, and I decided to sort of start the process of reorganizing my entire inner self and my whole structure. And from the video about the dismemberment experience that I had, which was with my first husband, that things had started to shatter and sort of spill out all over the place. And I was still in the process of reorganizing and putting things back together. So after that, and living up in the woods by myself, well, in the beginning with David, who is the one who wrote the books about me and sort of found me as a wonderful experiment that he thought proved some ultimate universal truth or reality or something like that, that he recorded nonstop for several years. I finally was on my own. And at that point, I went and sought counseling. I went and saw a psychologist and started trying to process the stuff from that perspective, from talking to somebody who had at least an overview of what was going on, so I could start to make sense of some of my life experiences. At the same time, I started doing a lot of the ritual magical stuff, some of which I've already shared, like the Cup Transformation, Starhawk's book, was very instrumental in helping me to reorganize my unconscious. And it takes time. It's not like it happens quickly. In a way, when you're trying to come out of something like that and become a unique individual, your truer self, it feels like you're trying to empty the ocean with a slotted spoon. There's like, you don't feel like you're making any progress. You take stuff out, but it still seems to be just as much there as if it's not really making an impact. And yet it does. You just, in the beginning, can't see it. And I sort of saw this at one point. I realized, since I'd had no models for behavior, for being an effective parent or effective person in any way, it was kind of like I found myself in a deep hole in the ground without a shovel. And I had to create a method for climbing out of that hole, filling the hole in and being able to stand on the ground and do something with it. And so I know that for any of you out there who are going through something similar, that it feels impossible, like it's overwhelming. There's just so much to do, and it's difficult to grasp that there actually is light at the end of the tunnel, which is one of the reasons I'm sharing this. I consider myself the light at the end of the tunnel because I succeeded, even though it hurts to talk about the past. I'm much more of an individual and a stronger person. I have distinctive notions about things that are right and wrong. I've defined myself and my reality, and I think that that's part of the process, that's important. So when I left Canada and went to Santa Cruz is when I was in a relationship, a short-term relationship, where on Christmas Eve I was assaulted by the man I was with in front of my children. And that was sort of like a culmination moment, I think, that sort of everything coalesced, because my daughter, she let out this blood-curdling scream. They say blood-curdling scream. It's true. I felt like my blood turned to ice. I never wanted to hear that sound again. And so it inspired me. And first I went to a self-defense class. And this is part of what I wanted to share. It's like the idea of going into a self-defense class at that point, even though it was obviously the right thing to do because I was terrified. I did not know if, when I went to pick up my mail, if he was going to walk into the same post office to pick up the mail, because at that point we had the same mailbox. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't eat. I was anxious, and I felt I needed to do something, and I wanted to show my daughter. I knew that moment was so intense, not just for me, but for her and for my son, that they needed to see what I did, and everything I did after that would have much more of an impact on their lives and their futures than anything else I'd ever done. And so my daughter actually went to the self-defense class with me, but I was scared to death to go into that class, and I could feel it. It was like this huge pressure, thinking of the idea of going in to learn to defend myself. And I sat with it to try and understand what was it about that was so frightening. And then I realized it was because I knew it would change me in an ultimate deep way. And once I changed, there would be no going back to a previous version of me. And I didn't know exactly what it would do, who I would become. And it's that fear of the unknown, of what might happen, that you can't tell for sure, that's out of your control to a certain extent. That's the fear. And so I made it through the self-defense class, and I wasn't the only woman there who brought a daughter who was about my daughter's age, which was interesting because that mother was doing kind of the same thing I was. And then not long after that, I ended up in an incest survivors group. So I was able to talk about what my father did to me, because my uncle, he was into younger children. My father was into younger teenagers. And as the oldest, I got that one. My other siblings didn't. That's about the only thing that didn't have happen to them. But, again, inappropriate, not okay, living a horror story, not fun in any way, shape, or form. But being able to face it in the incest survivors group allowed me to start healing that part of me as well. And again, doing ritual. During that time, I continued to do the cup transformation exercise, and I took every opportunity I could to talk to my inner child. I used rituals to talk to, with a teddy bear, and agree or promise to take care of that inner child that I was. And during this time frame, I realized that, we have different aspects to ourselves. We have our emotional self, we have our physical body self, and we have our intellectual self. At least those are the three I came up with at the time. And that I had evolved intellectually and I had grown physically, but emotionally I was still like 5 or 6 years old, because the moment that abuse started, it kind of fractured a part of my personality. And so then I had to go through all the things that if you were raised in a normal household where people weren't doing things like that to you, you would learn, that it's okay to say you're sorry, it's okay to make mistakes. Apologizing doesn't mean the world is going to come to an end and now all of a sudden you're going to melt into a puddle and disappear. These become normal things, and you learn better about how to interact with others. So I had the same response that I did to the self-defense class going into the incest survivors group. I think partly I was terrified I was going to remember something that I hadn't remembered. In the end, I hadn't actually remembered anything new. I had always remembered all those things, but I had just sort of put them aside. Like when the idea of my father assaulting me would try to come into my mind, I would kind of go like that and sort of push it away and not delve into it or feel it. And that's the thing. These things that happen to us in a life, in order to get through them, you need to actually experience them, and it's okay to get help from other people to learn how to do that. And I think all these parts, like the psychologist, the survivors group, the self-defense class, dealt with one aspect, and magic, ritual, dreams, working with my dream selves and stuff like that, dealt with another aspect of it, so that I could actually come out of that and be a person, an individual, not stuck in whatever it was that happened to me in the past. So I guess one of the reasons for talking about this is, first, to let you know you're not alone if you've had something like that happen to you, that there is help, and there's nothing wrong with asking for it, that it isn't easy and it doesn't happen right away, but that doesn't mean you're failing if you don't get instantaneous results. And it's a process, just like life. Life is a process. We just had our 28th wedding anniversary a couple of days ago, and I finally met the right person who was also an individual, and we allow each other to grow into better versions of ourselves since we got together. So there's not, we don't have a kind of power dynamic that a lot of people out there seem to have, where someone has to be right, someone has to be wrong, or someone has to be in charge and someone has to follow. We have an equal partnership. We do things together, and we respect one another for who we are and accept each other for exactly where we're at. And when I was leaving my second husband for beating the children and whatnot, and I had that experience with that tree, that sort of hit a chord in me so much that all these things that happened and all these things I thought were all generated by people, not the universe. It wasn't the universe that was rejecting me. It was what I thought society was, or what love was, or any of that, all that stuff. It's the universe just accepts us for who we are, and I would get glimpses of the possibilities when I was meditating, when I was going through all this stuff. So now, sometimes when I meditate, I send that energy back into the past to my younger self to encourage me to keep on going forward, and that there's hope, and there's better things to come. So, yeah, there's always so much stuff going on in our lives that we get stuck with, we get distracted by, or confused by, or whatever, and most of it is human related, not universe related. That's why I like cats. They're very much who they are, animals. They just exist, and they don't have questions about why they exist or whether they matter or any of that other stuff. And they can teach us that lesson if we let them, and let that energy in. So, the exercises I have shared are ones that I think were the most helpful to me, and ones that can assist in this as far as the magical part goes. And resources that you may have available to you on other levels are definitely encouraged. They're not contradictory. They don't have to fight each other. And I also believe in medication, because we're born into a body. We have to deal with the genetics of whatever body we're in, whatever abilities or lack of abilities, or work things. Some things work, some things don't. Whatever it happens to be, we have to figure out how we're going to respond to that, interface with it, and deal with it. So it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you just because you have a disability, or that you did something terrible in a past life and you deserve it. By the way, I don't believe in that. It's just genetics. So take care of yourselves and be kind to yourself, and allow yourself to make mistakes and have it be okay, because we're all in this learning together. So hopefully this has been more than just a horrible thing to hear and something useful. And so this is Siofra Bradigan, and this has been Siofra's Magic Alcove. Blessed be.